Of those sources of knowledge, the two most important are revelation and reason. And here's the big deal with Sadja. Those two must accord. If I have something that I have received through revelation, it's Torah leMoshe Sinai, we know we've got it through a fixed chain of transmission, and yet my intellect, my reason doesn't understand it, then my reason hasn't arrived yet at its full development. But if I have something that's regarded as like, a spiritual teaching, an idea that's come into Jewish thought, and it conflicts with reason, I can reject it. This is Sadja's famous argument in Emunot V'Deot. He brings examples. Now it's very trendy, and it has been in the last 20, 30 years, obviously because of Kabbalistic influence. People are suddenly realizing that the concept of Gilgul, for example, reincarnation, is a valid and sourced idea in Judaism. This is very strong in Kabbalah and Hasidic thought.
Sadigan says there's no source for it. In fact,
that's precisely my point, dude. That's my point. Sadja is telling you that Gilgul conflicts with his reason, and therefore he can reject it. It's very important to understand that some of the ideas that have in fact, we're going to look at this more later in just a few minutes, that there are, yes, guys.
I want to make a point that at the time Sadiq was not accepted this concept. And he thinks that there's a fringe thought.
But
a fringe group. At that time it was not.
Jewish.
I hear what you're saying. Today it's an accepted Jewish concept. We have many.
I'm just saying at that
No. You're right. But let me just say that as an adjunct. You're absolutely right. Today, through the development of Kabbalistic thought, specifically the Ari and so on, it's the known and accepted Jewish concept. But I would bet, not that we could ever prove this, that if Sadja was suddenly reincarnated, he would deny Gilgul. He would still say it doesn't make sense to him. And he was anyway. But that's a brilliant point that you've made. It has become accepted, but Sadja rejected. So there are sources. If a person wants to stand up and say, part of philosophy really is trying to work out the boundaries of what is accepted Jewish thought and what is not. And for Sadja, it's perfectly acceptable to reject Gilgul because it doesn't make sense to you. It's not an essential part of Jewish thinking. We're still within the Platonic phase of Jewish thought. Sadja, of course, brings in this idea that is now fully accepted within Jewish thought, that the creation of the world is ex nihilo. It's yesh me'ayin. It is something from nothing. God brought the universe into being, not from some primordial material, but zapped it into existence from ayin hamuchlat, from absolute nothingness.
Question.
Yeah.
Just according to Sadja, I just want to clarify what I think you said. If we know it's from revelation then, but our reasoning denies it, then it cannot be rejected, according to Sadja. Right? In other words, revelation trumps reason.
Revelation trumps reason. If we trust the valid chain of transmission. A person can't get up, for example, and say, I think Shabbat doesn't make sense, so I'm going to reject it. Yeah. Basically, the Torah is our yardstick for revelation. But I wish I could spend more time on Sadja. So there are huge examples of that. Sadja is also very, very big. And this, you might think, well, obviously, today we take this for granted. Sadja is extremely emphatic on the concept of free will. On the concept that every human being has bechira chofshit, has free will to choose. That's a fundamental concept that comes through Sadja. He goes right through Tanakh to show you examples where you might think someone's free will has been impeded, but in fact it hasn't. But moving on to the ultimate Platonic thinker, just on the cusp of a huge break within Jewish philosophy, and that we had, I'm moving on just 100 years or so, 150 years after that, 100 years or so, that until the 19th century, there was a famous book called the Fons Vitae. It was a philosophical work by a guy called Avi Chebron. And they didn't know whether Avi Chebron was Islamic or whether he was Christian. And only in the 19th century did they discover it is the ultimate Neoplatonic text. I'll explain what that means in a moment. Neoplatonic text of the Middle Ages. And only in the 19th century they discovered that in fact the Fons Vitae, which is the Latin term, is in fact the Makor Chaim of Shlomo ibn Gvirol. We thought Shlomo ibn Gvirol was a poet. He was, but he was also a major Neoplatonic philosopher. You know that Shlomo ibn Gvirol died in his 30s, extremely short but interesting life. You know that legend has it, and he's the only person that is attributed with this. He made a golem. I mean, he's not the only person that's attributed with making a golem, of course, but he is the only person attributed with having made a female golem. And the rumors abounded in the Middle Ages and beyond as to what exactly he did with this female golem. You can read it for yourself. In Makor Chaim, which is this stunning, what is the
When did he die?
When did he die? Around 10, he's around 1020 to 1050. Smack in the golden age of the Spain. Ibn Gvirol is a Neoplatonist, meaning that for him, you know that Plato basically argued that in the realm of ideas, in this realm of universals, there is a hierarchy, and at the top of this hierarchy of universal forms is the good. Good is the highest. But in fact, the Neoplatonists, as it emerged Platonic theory, as it went through thinkers like, Plotinus and Porphyry and so on, ultimately, at the essential basis of all spiritual and physical reality is this concept that we call the one. From the one, I mean, the Jewish people have always said God is one, but the Neoplatonists were very big on the idea that one, the number one, is God. From one emerges reality in a series of emanations, and each emanation is a further distancing and degradation from the sublime and essential one. Obviously, this idea after the 11th century crept well into Kabbalistic thought, so now we are very familiar with the idea of Hishtalshalut and the idea of emanation. But Ibn Gvirol was a classic Neoplatonic thinker. For him, form and matter are totally intertwined. Spiritual and physical are totally intertwined right up to the highest levels. What sits above them, if anything is above them, essentially outside the realm of being, is the concept of will. And this is going to have a very significant influence, not so much on Ibn Gvirol's own time, but later on. Then there is a big shift. There's a big shift. You know that for the whole of the previous, I'm now in the 11th century, but for the previous 600-700 years, Europe was basically living in what we call the Dark Ages. Civilization, learning was carried on much more in the Islamic world, of course, and the people that were running between the Islamic world and the Christian world was mostly us. Between us and the Muslims, philosophy, thought, abstract thinking, rationality was developing. In Christian Europe, it had taken very much a backstage. But by the 11th and 12th centuries, this learning was returning to Europe, and the church was starting to produce thinkers, not to mention the fact that the Islamic world, of course, through the Kalam and other Islamic schools of thought, was starting to produce big thinkers. There is a noticeable shift once the ideas of Aristotle, not of Plato, but of Aristotle, return into European thinking in the 11th and 12th centuries. Many people are familiar, obviously, with the big, towering figure that stands over the whole of the Middle Ages, as far as Jewish thought is concerned.